the river mouth, the bears catch only the tastiest, most tender salmon.
Okay, I did the meme. We all got it out of our systems now? Cool. So, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Released in early 2013, Revengeance is one of Platinum's most bizarre titles, and that's saying something. Acting as a collaboration between Platinum and Kojima Productions while they were still under the control of Konami, Rising was this strange mix of Platinum's hyper-fast action that they developed with Vanquish and Bayonetta, with Metal Gear's political postulating and sincere campiness, which blended together perfectly. The combat was on point, with a heavy emphasis on parries and precision. It had plenty of lengthy political diatribes Metal Gear is known for, without taking itself too seriously, and the soundtrack was stuffed with some of the cheesiest metal ever made. Legit, if you don't have the Rising soundtrack on a workout playlist, you're missing out. Coming in at a time when video games were becoming more and more self-serious, Metal Gear Rising revels in being a video game-ass video game. Despite being one of the best action games of the last decade though, Metal Gear Rising hit multiple snags during development that could have been a massive problem for its design, if not outright stopped it altogether. In all honesty, it's kind of a miracle it even got made at all. So with that in mind, how did we get to this if it had all those problems? And ultimately, how did those issues end up making Rising so good? Well, let's dig into that. Wait a minute, didn't the Vanquish remaster just come out? Shouldn't I cover that first? Now, historically speaking, among a lot of gaming circles, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is seen as a major failing of Kojima Productions staff while under the thumb of Konami, with Platinum Games being called in to clean up their mess. Which isn't completely untrue, but there is a little bit more to it than that. Originally, Rising started development in 2008, shortly after Metal Gear Solid 4's initial release. In his decade-long attempt to finally be free of the Metal Gear series, after completing work on 4, Hideo Kojima chose to give his younger staff at Kojima Productions an assignment of developing their own Metal Gear game while he continued on the next title in the series himself, giving the team the chance to build up their own skills to eventually take over for him. But working on the next numbered entry was still quite a daunting task, especially after seeing what happened with MGS4. So the devs instead proposed what would become Metal Gear Solid Rising, a side story focusing on Raiden, the protagonist of Metal Gear Solid 2, and explaining his development from the twink soldier in MGS2 into the ninja cyborg seen in 4.
I am lightning. The rain transformed.
Since the game was going to focus on Raiden instead of Snake though, rather than being about sneaking around jungles and military hideouts with nothing but a tranq gun and a cardboard box, the core gameplay of Rising would be built around Raiden's skills with a sword, ditching the title of tactical espionage action for lightning bolt action. The major focus of the game was going to be around the concept that you could dynamically cut everything from Metal Gears and soldiers to the world around you, using freely controlled sword mechanics to make deliberate slices, with each individual piece continuing to exist after being cut and even usable within levels for puzzles and stealth, which would have been a technological feat to accomplish, since no game has ever been able to do something so complex before. It was a really interesting concept to build their game around, but an unfortunate truth that the devs at KojiPro would have to learn is that something being cool in concept doesn't always mean it works in practice. As the project moved into the development stage proper, the mechanic of being able to freely slice apart the world clashed with the game design philosophy of methodological stealth that Metal Gear had been built on that the team was trying to keep, as there was no way to balance the level design when the player could potentially cut everything. And since there was no lead game designer specifically in charge of the project at the time, and the director Kojima left in charge only had experience as a background artist, with Kojima himself separately working on Peace Walker and later Ground Zeroes, there was no agreement on how to approach the problem, with each designer having their own ideas on how to improve it. But they kept working through in hopes they would eventually find the answer. And while that was going on, Kojima and his producers began teasing their new project before officially announcing Metal Gear Solid Rising at Microsoft's 2009 E3 press conference, when the only thing they had figured out was the core concept. This eventually led to a full debut trailer a year later showcasing what the devs had cobbled together in that time, showing Raiden ripping and tearing enemy cyborg spines in environments made specifically for that trailer. Being built off the then new Fox engine, the original version of Raiden systems appeared to be much slower and frankly stiffer than what we would eventually get. Going by the footage shown in trailers, you can see that while the cutting systems worked, it simply didn't have the fluidity needed for something with the tagline lightning speed action, having movement much closer to the controls of Metal Gear Solid 5. The big issue though continued to be trying to work the traditional stealth elements into Rising. Having a stealth action game that could either be sneaked the entire way through if the player was good enough, like a classic Metal Gear title, or that could be sliced apart entirely was the dream goal. But it wasn't coming together. All the pieces to a great game were fundamentally there, but the rigidness of the Metal Gear series that the devs learned from and were holding on to wasn't allowing for it to progress. The devs were stuck in a never-ending cycle that they couldn't break out of, continuously remaking the same game design, reworking the cutting system and movement, but always hitting the same roadblocks and never seeing any real progress towards a complete game. Which, admittedly, is a problem many people in creative fields have felt before. Sometimes all the pieces are there, but you're at a standstill on how you need to get it all together. It's a bitch of a cycle to get out of, and often needs an outside perspective to make you realize what's holding things back. So after checking in on development near the end of 2010 once Peace Walker had launched, and seeing the non-progress being made after showing off what they had at E3, Kojima had all but officially cancelled Rising. But seeing that there was still potential in the game's concept and all the work that had already been done, he decided to instead hand off Rising to another studio to see if it could be salvaged. Ideally, a studio that could handle doing high-speed ninja action with a heavy emphasis on combat. A studio like Platinum Games. Now, I've talked plenty about Platinum Games before, maybe too much, so I'm not going to go into an extensive background to explain why any troubled dev should go to them for help if possible. But suffice it to say, between Mad World, Vanquished, and Bayonetta, Platinum had already established a name for themselves in their 2 years of existence by the time Kojima came around to ask them to work on Rising. Which, fun fact, Inaba and the other producers at the studio thought was a joke at first. After being given what the Kojima Productions team had worked on and a general idea of what the design was supposed to be, within a few months, Platinum returned with an alpha version of the game that had everything Kojima and his producers could have realistically wanted, impressing them so much that they effectively gave Platinum's devs free reign on the project from there, even shifting the story so that it would be after MGS4, making it the latest in the timeline in order to give them more creative freedom over being too concerned about working around a mid-goal setting between 2 and 4. However, at the time of the public announcement that Rising was being handled by Platinum a year later, some Metal Gear fans were incredibly irritated at the prospect, not wanting to see a title from the serious and sophisticated Metal Gear franchise be managed by developers who make ridiculously cheesy, over-the-top action games. I mean, how campy is that? Oh, that was from Metal Gear Solid? Oh, awkward. There truly is egg on my face now. Snarky sarcasm aside, it was understandable why Metal Gear fans were apprehensive about Metal Gear Solid Rising changing over to another developer, because not only could it end up overshadowing MGS4's big finale, Platinum wasn't known for the more subtle stealth gameplay or scathing political commentary the series is known for.
What's it going to be? Loyalty to your country or loyalty to me?
With Platinum, you wouldn't be getting the 20-minute codec dialogues about political echo chambers and the dangers of memes in the digital age, but instead a heavy emphasis on combat with cutscenes where American senators rant about how every citizen should be free to start their own wars while doing wrestling moves. This is why the extra Revengeance was slipped into the title to establish the rebranding with the new devs, and removing Solid from it to emphasize that this was a spin-off entry outside of the Solid series. Placing Rising at the end of the timeline after a majority of the main characters had left also meant fewer concerns for accidentally creating inconsistencies in the mainline series, because it already had enough of those to begin with. For some diehard Metal Gear fans though, this was a compromise they still weren't willing to agree on, They wanted the Rising that had been promised, and didn't like the idea that the staff at KojiPro were giving up and letting another developer handle a Metal Gear game without them. But what's often forgotten, especially as more time goes on, is that this wasn't Kojima and his devs throwing in the towel, passing the buck onto another studio, and then splitting. While Platinum was focusing on combat and tweaking the design of what they were given, KojiPro staff were still extensively involved in Rising, working on the story, cutscenes, and setting, and both teams coming together for the art direction. Revengeance wasn't just a development project for Platinum alone, like some might think. It became a collaboration. Both studios were constantly working in tandem, with KojiPro making sure that Rising kept true to the Metal Gear series as best as possible, where Platinum was making sure that the game quality was fine-tuned to their standards. However, in designing Rising, there was still constant clashing between these two studios in order to find the best way possible to do things. Even with Platinum's help, there was a continuous balancing act with every aspect of the game, between the stage design working with the ninja run and cutting system, trying to maintain a smooth 60 FPS while being able to slice up models into hundreds of separate pieces, and even how the game should look, since there were debates internally on if it should be more futuristic to go with all the cyborgs, or closer to the modern aesthetic that MGS4 already had. It kinda makes sense that there would be this much contention though. Keep in mind how drastically different KojiPro and Platinum are when it comes to their approaches in game design and development, and nothing showcases that more in how Rising Revengeance handled its stealth. And from this point on, I'm just going to say Rising, because that's just much easier to say. When asked to rework the game, one of the biggest design fixes that Platinum did on Rising was heavily tone down the stealth aspect of the original concept, since it was conflicting with the high-speed action that was intended to be the highlight of the game. They didn't remove it entirely, as you can still pull off stealth executions if you keep out of sight from enemies by hiding in boxes and observing their patterns, but there is a certain doesn't matter tone to it all, which comes up a lot in the level design. Now, the obvious observation when comparing Rising to the other Metal Gear games is that it's significantly more linear because it was designed to be combat encounter focused, similar to Bayonetta, even rating you on how you did in fights with its own style ranking system for you to feel bad about when you fuck up. Which is a big factor. But the detail to the level design that is just as noticeable is that there's also more verticality to it. This is because in their desire to differentiate him from Snake, the devs at KojiPro wanted Raiden's version of stealth to feel more like hunting, being about ninja assassination kills not that far off from something like Assassin's Creed. So having higher vantage points to scout out and attack from felt the most true to that. But if you're experienced with MGS games, you may have noticed something odd about a key staple of the series, the Soliton radar. In most previous Metal Gear titles, the Soliton radar was your map for viewing enemy movement patterns and their line of sight, making it easier to plan out how you would move. But in Rising, possibly because of the fact enemies could be on varying levels, the sight line was removed from the radar. Instead, you're meant to use this sort of solid eye system that highlights enemy units in the area. The thing is, though, that you no longer have any idea of where enemies might be looking and how far their range is, making attempts at stealth in smaller and closed levels much more challenging, if not entirely impossible.
Raiden, if they continue to increase security, they may shut out all outside network connections. Please do your best to avoid being seen.
In Assassin's Creed or even Batman, not being able to see the enemy's sights doesn't matter because if you are seen, you can easily go into hiding again. But with Rising, being caught forces you into a combat encounter. Whether intentional or otherwise, this is the designers telling you it doesn't matter. Because you're going to kill them anyway, you don't need to know where they're looking. The only place where the levels and placement of enemies allows for unmitigated focus on sneaking was in the DLC levels for Blade Wolf, where nearly the entire thing can be perfectly stealthed. But by design, stealth is meant to be a background thought in Rising. Another option for the player, but not something they can be committed to. Most combat encounters you run into are set up so that you have no option to hide, and when there are sections where you can catch an enemy off guard, allowing for a sneaky stab through the chest or saving a civilian hostage by strategically dropping an EMP grenade to quickly disrupt the group, the stealth is clearly meant to facilitate the combat. In fact, there are times where taking advantage of a sneak kill can cause you to miss out on a ranked combat encounter because they won't initiate until you're spotted. More than anything, that's clearly stating where the intentions of the game really lie. And that brings us to what Platinum was brought on for in the first place. It might be one of the most played out sayings in game criticism, But Metal Gear Rising really is the poster child for the fundamental design principle of easy to learn, difficult to master. At first glance, Rising's combat functions nearly identical to how similar games in the genre work. There's a fast light attack, a secondary attack that changes depending on the unique weapon you have equipped, which also changes the combos you can do. There are skills and upgrades you can purchase, along with items you can find to help you depending on the situation. Nothing one would call game-changing. Without getting into all the advanced tech you can learn, like animation cancels and dodge offset combos if you're really willing to take the time to practice, Rising's core combat seems pretty simple on the surface of it. So if you have little care about rankings and are as dense as a brick, you can get decently far into Rising playing it like an average hack and slash game, just running around and mashing to cut. But what defines good gameplay in Rising, and is essential for getting through later difficulties, is the parry and cutting mechanics. Because it ruined the game's balance and the ability to maintain a proper level design, the ability to cut everything within the world from the original Rising was scaled back a touch, with Platinum focusing on making the freeform blade mode feel good to use in combat first and foremost, and every other mechanic being built around that, which was actually for the best. You can still cut parts of the environment like walkways that enemies might be standing on, but the majority of the system is centered around its use against enemies. From cutting limbs to make them more vulnerable, to eliminating their ability to use their own weapons, adding an extra layer to fighting stronger enemies like the Mastiffs. The Mastiffs are one of the biggest threats of the non-boss enemies you can run into, as they can easily toss Raiden around like a ragdoll. But as soon as you can slice their arms off, you limit their attack options to just dropkicks, making it much easier to predict what they're going to do. Combined with a variety of layered enemy designs, each with their own attack types, this leads to some on-the-fly strategy of finding the best enemies to eliminate in a batch, strategically taking out their ability to move or attack, and then refocusing on the ones that are the most dangerous so that executions don't get interrupted. But since being able to cut apart any enemy at will would have utterly destroyed any game balance in the combat, it was decided you first have to weaken and open up tougher enemies before you can go for a killing strike. And that's when you get the famous Zandatsu, which restores Raiden's energy and fuel cells when you connect with the weak point on an enemy and get the button prompt. Along with making it easier to deal with tougher groups when you're low on health, the Zandatsu fully recharging your vitals means being able to go right back into blade mode immediately after a confirmed kill. So when you've perfected the system to the point that you don't have to take 10 swings to possibly hit the weak point, fights become a constant bouncing between enemies, tearing out their spines, and then moving on to the next. Even taking advantage of the invincibility you get from the Zandatsu to avoid damage from surrounding enemies that could interrupt you. Honestly though, the best part about the blade system is the ability to absolutely decimate an enemy after you stun them. There's just something so cathartic about being able to turn cyborgs into ribbons after a tough fight. And since the end of the battle style rankings factor in your longest hit combo, and every successful slice counts as a hit, there is some level of incentive to tear everything to shreds, as long as you don't go overboard and miss a Zandatsu. But since you can be constantly attacking, especially against multiple enemies, there's also how you respond to enemy attacks. In designing Rising's defensive options, Platinum took what they learned from Bayonetta's combat design and retooled some of its ideas into mechanics that were more aggressive and intentional to work with how Raiden played. The main way this manifested was in the parry system, Rising's fundamental defensive mechanic. As the name implies, parries in Rising are about properly timed reactions to deflect attacks, and if you wait long enough into an enemy's attack animation for the precise moment before it hits you before blocking, it immediately stuns them and leaves them open for a Zandatsu. Unlike systems meant to get you away from enemy attacks, parrying has the player move into an attack, which feels a bit intimidating at first. Granted, the window that the parry is active for is incredibly forgiving once you've learned it, but it does take time to get used to since players are often given ways to purely block or move away from attacks. Using Bayonetta's Witch Time dodge as a direct point of comparison, which has a large amount of iframes and can avoid damage from any direction, Raiden's parry is noticeably harder to use, as it's purely directional and can be knocked out of by specific attacks. Some have even complained that the parry is difficult to use because it's tied directly to the attack button, as you can accidentally attack when you want to parry. But I'd say this was a very deliberate decision on the part of the designers. Having a pure block button setup could have very easily led to passivity during combat, where the player could sit back and wait for attacks to block, which could have destroyed the fast intention of the gameplay. If you could hide behind a guard like Dark Souls, it would have been way too simple to play defensively. Parrying means a deliberate action in the middle of combat, So having the parry tied to the attack button means you're making the decision in the moment to stop attacking and block your enemy. Even when defending, the player has to respond and move forward. This deliberateness is also why, while you're able to cancel out of weaker attack animations with a parry if you see an enemy about to hit you, you can cancel out of stronger attacks. So you can get punished if you're too reckless and commit too hard to a combo as an enemy's about to wind up for a hit. This is why Rising Scene is one of Platinum's more unforgiving titles, because it demands the ability to respond to enemies with precision or pay for it. But when you're in the zone with all the mechanics it presents, it gives you this feeling of being an invincible ninja that's mastered the blade. It really makes you feel like Raiden. It's not as if the game doesn't gradually train you on how to use these mechanics to their best either. Each boss fight you encounter over the course of Rising exemplifies certain mechanics or systems that you need to learn in order to get to the end of the game in a satisfying way. Ray teaches basic mechanics like the ninja run, and the fact you need to be prepared for quick time events at key moments in battle. Blade Wolf needs you to get the fundamentals of parrying down. Mistral has you using Blade Mode to limit enemy options for attacks by cutting her weapon apart. Monsoon requires being able to parry within a second's notice of an attack in any direction, and Sundowner concentrates on being able to hit clear lines during Blade Mode in a single strike, lest you be exploded. Because of that structure, you're expected to be able to handle yourself by the time you get to the showdown with Sam, acting as both a gatekeeper and warm-up to Armstrong, who demands you be able to use everything from properly timed parries to precise cutting to make it through the multiple stages of his fight. And because these games are meant to be replayed, gradually ramping up the difficulty, Armstrong is effectively your end-of-tutorial boss in normal mode to prove you can comfortably handle the tougher difficulties, before Revengeance mode eventually curb-stomps you back into the dirt. Compared to DMC or Bayonetta, which are about doing extravagant combos and relentlessly attacking, Rising is all about calm efficiency, doing precise attacks, watching for telegraphs to parry, opening up the enemy, and going for the killing strike at the exact right moment. That isn't to say everything Platinum did was perfect though, as there are some teeth-grittingly frustrating design choices holding it back. Because it was 2013, there of course needed to be forced walking sections, which could have been fine the first time around. It's important for getting across certain beats in the story. Except it makes replays of missions significantly more tedious than they should be, as there's no way to skip them. Then there's the camera that really struggles at times because its viewpoint is forcibly tied to Ryan's back, which makes sense for the moment-to-moment combat, as it's focused on being directed at a single enemy in front of the player, but it results in a lot of jerking around if you attempt to pry it off for a better view, especially during larger boss fights when you're trying to look up, as the camera constantly wants to be redirected to Ryan's back regardless of the situation. Also, not sure who thought adding flying enemies into an action game that's nearly entirely focused on ground level combat was a good idea, but I sincerely question their credentials. Honestly, I think the designers at Platinum just forgot that Raiden isn't Bayonetta and doesn't have the air mobility that she does. On a fundamental level, dealing with one slider on occasion isn't terrible since they are easy to destroy, as long as you take them out before they start spamming rockets. But the issue is multiplied with each additional one, namely as their attacks can come from far off screen, giving you little time to respond and often disrupting combos, thus becoming genuine migraines for anyone attempting to get high style rankings. I'm sure the designers just wanted to add more variety into the combat encounters, but frankly, the sliders are easily the worst enemies to fight in the entire game. You do eventually get a decent response for mid-air combat in Monsoon Sai, since it can pull you up to airborne enemies while stunning them, allowing for some impressive combo strings, but that highlights another issue, in that somehow, despite every previous title in the genre having long since figured it out, there's no easy way to switch between your secondary weapons on the fly, instead having you stop entirely and sort through a clunky menu to get the ones you want. Like, why design it in such a way? The answer is likely that the devs wanted to keep true to Metal Gear's classic inventory systems, but the game has made such a point that Raiden is so drastically different from Snake that it doesn't make sense to limit the player's freedom of expression in combat by staying true to systems that were made for an old-school stealth game. Fortunately, style players have found ways to circumvent this issue by using blade-canceling animations, allowing you to freely switch weapons mid-combo. But even then, it's incredibly inconvenient and is just a frustrating reminder of the system that's being worked around. And then there's the story, which, where do I even start?
But first you need to take a dump.
Now, apologies in advance if a lot of this comes off as incoherent rambling, Because, well, it's a Metal Gear game, so that comes with the territory, but also Rising's story is frankly really, 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 really dumb. And I say that as an expert on the subject. But that's kind of why I like it. While some took issue with Rising's story being shuffled around in the timeline after Platinum came on because fans wanted to see the change of Raiden from 2 to 4, I think where it ended up was actually for the best, as it avoided the Phantom Pain issue of showing a redundant story where we already know the conclusion, and instead showed what the world would look like after the Solid saga. As established, Rising is set in a post-Metal Gear Solid 4 world, which is an incredibly important detail considering how the events of that game influence the setting. War really has changed. PMCs are now made up entirely of cyborgs, and Snake is no longer around to save the day. The Patriots and everyone associated with Big Boss are now truly gone, and Raiden, after becoming a cyborg prior to the Guns of the Patriots incident, has joined a private military security firm in order to make a living without being directly on the battlefield. It's a solid setup to explore what a world after MGS4 would look like. It just doesn't do that much with it. Despite being written by Etsu Tamari, who'd done writing for the Metal Gear series since MGS1, Rising definitely feels like a Platinum story, in that the story prominently takes a backseat to the actual game. Metal Gear Solid games are known for being incredibly convoluted and filled with massive conspiracies and big revelations, where you can talk for hours about the narratives and commentary layered into everything. But Rising is fairly blunt. There's no huge late game reveals that recontextualizes everything you've done, no meta commentary on the nature of video games, few moral questions are raised. Raiden is simply on a world tour to stop the big bads from creating a new generation of child soldiers and causing more wars, and that remains his mission throughout the entire story. But the game's almost asking you not to think about it too hard, with a lot of essential information on what's going on being tied to codec conversations that could easily be missed so that you can focus entirely on slicing up dudes. Rising is so straightforward that there's even some jabs at how complex and sometimes contrived this series can be.
And who does? The Patriots are gone.
Those guys just manage the war economy. They didn't invent it. Did you think every battle in history was all part of some big old conspiracy? Bullshit! War is just part of who we are. Why fight it?
The story treats itself almost like a tongue-in-cheek parody of the Metal Gear series, free from the seriousness of the Solid saga. Like, of course stopping the Patriots wasn't going to end all wars. Not every event in the world could be manufactured by them or the philosophers. Of course PMCs weren't going to go away after the Guns of the Patriots, and cyborg technology was only going to escalate things. But Rising is also a game where there's a man with a gun sheath, the main character disguises himself as a mariachi to sneak into Mexico, and a US presidential candidate does dropkicks to a disembodied cheering crowd on top of a giant spider mech while quoting Martin Luther King Jr.
I have a dream!
What?
God bless it, the game does still try though, and honestly, that's where the spirit of Metal Gear does shine through. Juxtaposing the abject silliness of a US senator acting like a pro wrestler cutting a promo, with sincere attempts to analyze how the war economy influences politics. If that doesn't sum up what people love about Metal Gear, I don't know what else can. Of course, we don't get the deliberate focus of themes that Metal Gear Solid 3 had, though I don't think the series has been able to do that ever since, even with other Metal Gear games, so it's hard to judge Rising for that, but Rising also does a bit of fumbling with what it is attempting to say, and the core of the problem lies with choosing Raiden as the main character.
I'm saying Jack is back.
Now, it's no secret that Raiden is a controversial character. Back during the release of MGS2, Raiden was introduced as a pseudo-replacement for Solid Snake, acting as a meta-commentary on the nature of sequels, player control, and the idolization of war heroes. Raiden's character goes through a lot of turmoil as the Patriots tried to mold him into the perfect soldier through an entirely false recreation of the Shadow Moses incident that Snake went through 4 years earlier, psychologically tormenting him as his entire being is put into question. But a lot of Metal Gear fans took issue with the bait and switch of replacing the cool soldier Solid Snake with a white-haired anime boy whining about being a slave to the Patriots since childhood. Oh boo-hoo, your entire life was a lie. Get over it. So in MGS4, a game Kojima had little interest in actually making, choosing to focus on fan service above all else, Raiden's character arc went from fighting to achieve his own personal freedom after being controlled by others since he was a child, to being transformed into a badass angsty cyborg ninja, slicing up Gecko units like watermelons, and single-handedly blocking a battleship in order to better appeal to fans who disliked him in 2 for not being cool enough. Raiden had little to actually contribute to MGS4's story, to the point he could have been removed from it and not much would have been lost. But Kojima felt obligated to wrap up every possible unanswered question of the series after being bugged about it so much that Raiden was put in anyway and gave him as many badass moments as possible for good measure, which just feels disingenuous to what his character was about. So ultimately, Rising ends up having to maintain what Raiden was about in MGS2 while balancing the decisions that went into his character from 4, which it handles quite admirably, all things considered. MGS2 ends with Raiden literally forsaking the player's control so that he can forge his own path, finally free from those that tried to control him for so long, which makes having him return as a playable character highly questionable. But Raiden was also raised as a child soldier, which mentally scarred him. So of all the characters in the series, he would be the most sympathetic to war profiteers attempting to use orphans to make killer cyborgs. Rather than be rooted in, let's make Raiden cool, Rising's use of Raiden is rooted in him using his freedom to make sure no child is forced to experience the life he had to, and exploring why others choose to go to war, whether it's for their own ideals, profit, lack of other options, or the belief that there's no options. And this is what makes Senator Armstrong such a compelling character to oppose Raiden in the final act, as he represents the illogical extreme of what Raiden wants. You see, if one of the core themes of MGS2 is regarded as personal freedom should be how people choose to act, not controlled by others, Rising is the interesting but counter-response, where it ends on personal freedom, but within reason. Just like Raiden, Armstrong rejects the desire of the Patriots. He isn't interested in a fully controlled world where the truth is finally tuned by algorithms and individuals are molded into the perfect cogs to keep society going without issue. Instead, he wants to become president through the use of the war economy so that he can eventually free America from any such systems, bringing America back to zero so that any rules prohibiting its people can be dismantled, and create a world of might equals right. Unlike the Patriots' goal of choosing what's right for the people, it will be the people deciding what's right for them through their own strength of will, where the strongest memes will be the ones that live on.
Making the mother of all omelets here, Jack. Can't fret over every egg.
In his insane, giga-brain conservative mind, that's why Armstrong sees Raiden as a worthy successor of his ideology of a stronger America where every citizen can choose to fight for what they personally believe in, because that's exactly what Raiden did. Raiden did in fact work his way up through fighting for what he believed was right, and that's what defined him. And as much as he wants to defend the rights of the weak, understanding that systems need to be in place to protect the less privileged and keep everything from going full Lord of the Flies, Raiden's only response to the Senator's belief is, fight me then, bro. Through his multiple battles with the Winds of Destruction, Raiden's ideals, his meme, proved to be the strongest, and the only way he's going to show Armstrong he's wrong is by proving him right. In the end, Raiden killing him proves that Raiden's justice was the strongest of the two, and him continuing to fight against those he sees as villains is in a way perpetuating what Armstrong believed.
You don't let legal bullshit get in the way. And if it costs a few lives, so be it.
As I implied earlier though, as much as I can praise what the game does with Raiden and his conflict with Armstrong, there's also some mixed messaging with his characterization. Because of his backstory of being raised on the battlefield, there's a strange underlying theme about how Raiden's really a psychopath that actually loves killing, and after dealing with Monsoon and Sam's moral taunting for about 5 minutes, when they somehow project the thoughts of other cyborgs into his head to make him feel guilty, Raiden goes, fuck it, if I have to be a bloodthirsty killer to do what's right, I'll do it. Which, okay, so to do what's right you have to relish in the killing? Why? What? But this is simply an excuse to implement the game's own form of Devil Trigger / Umbra and Climax style of system, and to its credit, does mechanically reflect the mental instability Raiden is experiencing. It's no longer about precision and killing as efficiently as possible. It becomes about ruthlessly shredding everything in his path, as it's nearly impossible to use Ripper mode and have the precision of using mechanics like the Zandatsu since Raiden is recklessly holding nothing back, making it useful if you're dealing with a group of tough enemies. It's just unfortunate that the game doesn't seem like it knows what it wants to do with the Jack the Ripper storyline. because it's brought up for an entire chapter and then dropped about 30 minutes later with no real resolution. Ignoring the forced contrivance of Jack the Ripper though, Rising actually does a lot to salvage Raiden's character after the juggling between 2 and 4. While saving the child's brains is his driving force, we still get a lot of glimpses into his personality, mostly through the codec calls, where there's time for him to actually have conversations with the Maverick team. This is honestly where the best dialogue of the entire game is, probably because the writer did the codecs in previous games. It's here that we get Raiden joking around with Courtney, discussing with Doctor the modern application of cyborgs, quipping with Blade Wolf about being a robot dog, and just fanboying over Solid Snake. It's in these moments that we get a genuine look into who Raiden is when he isn't being psychologically manipulated or sacrificing himself for others. We take a break from Jack the Ripper and spend time with just Jack.
Collectively, they're known as the Winds of Destruction.
The what? They all have action figures too?
You're one to talk, Mr. Lightning Bolt.
Who told you?
In the past, some have said that Rising should have been its own thing rather than being a spin-off of Metal Gear. But ignoring the fact that the game wouldn't have happened if that was the case, this game wouldn't have been nearly as enjoyable if it wasn't a Metal Gear game. Even with its weaker plot, there's a certain charm to Rising's story that comes from it being treated as tangential to the Metal Gear series, being allotted more leeway than those from the mainline games, but still having that irreverent tone. The protagonist is likable and better expanded on, the villains have that campy fun to them. It's genuinely hard not to find some enjoyment from playing as Raiden as he runs up the blade of a raid to cut its arm clear off. What's there not to like about it all?
If you're a cyborg, you know who Day is?
Anyway, so that's it. That's Metal Gear Rising. I mean, what else is there to really say? Oh, right. For those that have followed me for a while, you may have noticed I rarely spend much time on the music of games. And that's because my knowledge on music theory is on the limited side. So I often feel I can't say much beyond music good. But considering the legacy of Metal Gear Rising's soundtrack, I'm pretty sure I'd have a lot of screaming in the comments if I didn't at least briefly mention how the music worked into it all, even if it abruptly comes at the end and disrupts the flow of the entire video. So if their design philosophies and approaches to development weren't already different enough, the way KojiPro and Platinum tended to handle their music was total opposites, where the former typically had Norihiko Hibino and Harry Gregson Williams creating tracks in the style of big Hollywood action films, and Platinum's music often sounded like So when you have two conflicting styles meeting, each with their own preference of music, which direction do you go? Well, like the rest of the game, Rising actually ends up meeting somewhere in the middle. Metal Gear Solid's traditional Hollywood-style instrumental tracks were kept for the downtime while you're navigating levels and cutscenes, where Platinum's faster, aggressive style was used for action sequences and combat encounters. But since the soundtrack had to go with Platinum's gameplay, Rising's music direction was largely handled by Platinum's Naoto Tanaka, with Jamie Christopherson called in to act as composer and songwriter. Originally, the music was going to have more of an old-school 80s metal sound to it, but Christopherson recommended something modern with electric elements to it, as that would fit the futuristic cyborg setting of the game better. An important factor to this decision, though, is that similar to the development of the game, the music itself ended up being a massive collaborative effort. Because no one involved had experience with heavy metal and electric musical styles, along with Christopherson as lead composer, the lead guitarist of the metal band Machine Head, Logan Motter, and the dubstep group Maniac Agenda were also brought on to help create the boss and combat themes, giving them a heavy electric dubstep sound that keeps the intensity high throughout. So each battle with the Desperados builds up from the very start of the fight as it shifts into this fast-paced mix of cheesy metal riffs and electric dubstep wobbling, which genuinely couldn't fit the game's campy tone better, while still being hype as hell in the moment. It's hard to hear the opening to that fight with Blade Wolf and not be immediately pulled into it. In terms of design, the combat tracks were created in musical stems so that the vocals and instrumental tracks could be gradually layered on as the boss fight escalates, eventually reaching the crescendo in the final stages of the battle when the power vocals kick in. this sounds like a simple idea, but how often is this phased escalation of music implemented into games? Honestly, it's kind of genius. Without even looking at the health bars, you can tell you've reached the climax of these boss fights solely by the extra impact that the addition of the vocals give, making each one of them feel incredibly memorable because of it, especially Armstrong's final fight at the end, because it's actually all power vocals. You're trained from the start of Rising to associate lyrics in the boss fights as signaling the big finale, but with Armstrong, you've reached the climax of the game, the absolute peak. So after a small build-up with the instrumentals, it's all vocals from here. Frankly, I don't think I'm really saying much that people who've played the game don't already know. But what's really great about this music design is that multiple vocalists from around the world were used to voice each track, giving each boss theme its own distinct sound that fits with the character they're associated with. Like Mistral's A Stranger I Remain being performed by Free Dominguez from the industrial metal band Kidney Thieves, being the only woman singer on the OST for the only woman boss fight. Each vocal track then has lyrics centered around the boss and their place in the story at that moment, such as Sam's boss theme, The Only Thing I Know for Real, lamenting how he's forgotten any reason why he fights, but it's been so long that fighting is all he has for an identity, and the only thing that's going to stop him is someone stronger. In these clashes of ideals, in their final moments, you get the summation of why these characters choose to fight through the music that accompanies them, each with their own unique voice that goes with them. This is all a very long-winded way of saying, Rising's music is fucking rad.
We're done here!
Between everything from the incredible music, the campy story, and the engaging gameplay, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance was a massive collaborative effort that only worked when different studios, multiple developers, and conflicting ideas came together and continuously clashed until they created something entirely unique, and really goes to show how important collaboration can sometimes be when making truly great art. Yes, the ideas for the original Rising sounded like it could have been amazing, and it's a disappointment that it didn't work out. But it's worth remembering that it's rare anything looks exactly like it did during the planning phase. Sometimes when making something, you have to make concessions about what the end product will be. That's an ugly truth about being a creator of any kind. Talk to anyone who creates, whether it be YouTube videos, films, paintings, or music, and they'll tell you that the infinite potential that a blank canvas has can be intimidating, because it can be whatever you imagine. But as soon as you start to narrow your work down and realize what isn't possible or that things have to be cut, it feels like you're failing that original idea. It can't be everything at once. It's never gonna be the perfect thing you imagined. But that's what's kind of beautiful about the story of Metal Gear Rising. As Kojima said in an interview with Famitsu, Metal Gear Rising wouldn't have been born if it were us alone, and I don't think Platinum could have made it by themselves either. In that way, the word collaboration doesn't seem like enough. Rising could have ended altogether in 2010, and for some that's exactly what happened. But out of it all, we ended up getting two talented teams working together to make something that was reflective of both of their unique styles that could have never been made by one of them alone. Sadly though, considering the current state of Konami and what happened with KojiPro, I can't see us getting another Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance anytime soon. Which is disappointing because I would have loved to see the ideas here refined even further. But considering what could have happened if Kojima never went to Platinum in the first place, we're pretty lucky to get what we did. So I guess we just have to accept that it has to be this way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.